Okay, this recording is for the Dixon Public Library's Oral History Project. And today, which is September 25th, 1998, I'm going to be talking with Dorothy Wallace in her home, surrounded by a cornfield, just outside the city limits, I guess, less than a mile. My name is Paul Ferrell, and let's start talking. We should start with some family history. Now, you're a Dawson.
I was a Dawson.
You was.
Yes,
you were.
I was a Dawson.
Well, tell me as far back as you know of your, well, both sides of your family.
Well, I go back to 1921, which have a birthday coming up pretty soon. My mother came to Dixon in about 1917. She taught in the high school. And my father, I believe, arrived in Dixon to work for his brother sometime 1912 or so.
Now, where'd they come from?
Well, my father's family were from Tennessee, near Nashville. Have very few relatives remaining back there anymore. In fact, John and I were just back there about 2 months ago, I guess. Mother's father worked for the railroad, and so she kind of went wherever the family went, of course. And at the time, they were from Ohio, and at the time she was out of high school and ready to start school or university. Her father was in Washington, so she started University of Washington in Seattle. And then he got transferred down to the Bay Area, so she moved down to UC in Berkeley. And I think came to Dixon her third year of teaching. She thought it was a good idea to stay 2 years in one place before he left. But at any rate, they were married in 1920 when my father had been overseas. And as I mentioned when we were talking a little earlier, he and his brother were in the Capitol Hotel, where our present vacant lot on the main intersection of Dixon is, at 1st and A Street. It burned while my father and mother were on their honeymoon, burned up all my father's clothes that he didn't have with him and everything. And not too long after they were married in late 1920, he found out he contracted tuberculosis in World War I, excuse me. And I was born in November of 21, and he had then been in a sanitarium up in Alta for some little time, and was there, I think, until they came back to Dixon, I think, when I was about a year old. And Mother started teaching again, and they purchased 14 acres a mile out of town, and Dad decided that if he had to be outside and not be a bartender inside, that maybe he could raise chickens and eggs.
Would that be better for his health, too?
Oh, yes. That was the thing. They said, I think he said at the time he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, he was smoking 14 cigars a day or something like that.
Did he quit?
Yeah. He the only time I can recall my father smoking as I was growing up was when he had his good suit on and was going someplace. And when I was an ornery little kid and starting to smoke at a very early age, I knew there was always at least a half a pack of Lucky Strikes in his suit pocket. So at any rate, that's not too historical, except they give me a bad time because I'm still smoking, and I say 60-year habits are too hard to break. So, but at any rate, Mother taught in the high school. Dad learned about chickens, and they started building chicken houses
Your dad learned about chickens. Oh, that was at
Davis. And I don't remember. I think they started out with probably 500 birds. I was little. I don't remember how many. But every year they build a few more chicken houses, and I think at the time the old California style houses that were built double walled with redwood and stuff that nobody could afford to build now, plus they were highly labor intensive. I think we had about a quarter of a mile of chicken house on both sides of the slough, and then they branched out into cage houses, which were, some people think hard on chickens, but they're much easier to take care of and don't require as much labor and so forth. And Mother, she spent all day in school, of course, and she really liked to be outside, and I don't know where she got the idea that she was going to branch out into the squab business, but she ended up with about 2,500 pigeons, and the squabs were shipped to market. The train stopped in Dixon in those days. That I remember well. Twice a week she'd pick up the squabs, and they'd go in crates and be loaded onto the train here and shipped to, I think, Hayward. There was a processing plant in Hayward. Then they'd send the empty cages back. Continuing project. She used to tease Dad that during the Depression, when eggs were 9 cents a dozen, and at least she made a little money on her squabs because they were enjoyed by Chinese people in the Bay Area, and I think that and the bigger hotels, the old squab under glass, so to speak. But she did very well, and she enjoyed it, and she kept them until they built this house where I live in 1952, and so after she moved down to here, she was sure that nobody was taking care of her squabs like she did when she was there, so they decided to she sold them, and they tore down the lofts, and by that time we'd quit using, maybe not by then quite. At any rate, they were building some less labor-intensive chicken houses, and I had left high school and went to business school a short time, worked for an attorney in Placerville, and that's where I met my husband, and we were married in 41, and rationing he was a meat cutter by trade, and rationing was starting, and well, he went off to the Army, but they kept him 2 weeks, I think, and sent him home from San Luis Obispo, maybe flat feet and 2200 vision in one eye. They didn't want him. So in the meantime, my family was finding it very difficult along in 42, 43 to find help at the ranch, because anybody that was able-bodied had gone off to the service. And so George, my husband, said that, well, they were considering selling the chicken ranch because they just couldn't get labor.
How much labor would a ranch like that take?
Well, in the old-fashioned California-style housing, we usually had 3 or 4 men working for 12 or 14,000 birds. Well, at one time that was a lot of chickens. Now the egg-producing flocks it's not uncommon to be 1 million or more. In the cage houses, and well, my brother, for a short time, came home to work on the ranch after he got out of Cal, and he enjoyed pretty much outside of when there were big jobs like vaccinating or cleaning houses or something like that. It required extra temporary help, but basically two of them could. In fact, I suppose I think when we finally went out of the poultry business and the buildings were leased out to a man who was headquartered down out of Merced, I think, he may have had two men here. He was running about 40,000 birds here. At the time we went out of the business, we had 37,000, I think, something like that. But that, as I say, that's still small. It was not profitable. That's why we went out of business. So my mother was a very practical soul who said one year that she'd read that the loss per bird in the state of California was, I don't know, half a cent or 2 cents a bird. That it had been a very bad year for egg producers, and she said, well, she was certainly happy that we had the small number that we did instead of a larger number, since that was the average loss.
She wasn't an accountant.
But to get back to family, mother taught until 1930 when my brother was born, and I think was a very good teacher. At least older people around tell me that she was. She retired then, so I didn't ever have her in school, but she enjoyed teaching, and she was very, very practical, outspoken lady.
What level did she teach?
She taught a variety of things while she was in Dixon. I think at the time she retired, she was teaching she was teaching shorthand, typing, and bookkeeping. However, she had a master's in math from UC in 1916, I believe, when there weren't too many women getting masters in math. Most of her courses were small classes, she said, with young men who didn't think a woman should be there. And my mother was a very sharp lady. She, for years, of course, did all the business bookkeeping and everything. She unfortunately had the experience of being kidnapped one time, and we had rather a harrowing night, but when she was safely home in the morning, it was said that one of her former students was sitting in at Dawson's that morning and said, well, that guy didn't know it, but he got the wrong lady. Although I think it did, she was a long time getting over it.
You gotta tell me how she was kidnapped. What happened?
Yeah. Well, she and Dad came home from playing bridge one evening about, she said just before 11, because she knew she was headed for bed with the 11 o'clock news. The man was waiting here in the house. They also had a great big boxer dog that they were keeping for my brother at the time, and I guess he'd made friends with the dog. At any rate, she went to bed, turned on the 11 o'clock news, and said she could hear Dad coming down the hall, and he was not in good health in those days, and he was talking, she thought, to the dog. Well, when he got into the bedroom, he was followed by a man with a sawed-off shotgun, and they said, take the car, whatever. Well, no, he was taking her. And it's nice to be able to kind of joke about it now. He was tying up my father on the floor, and she said, don't tie him like that. Do you want to kill him? Don't tie him that tightly. So the guy didn't. And the other thing that I think helped me keep my sanity through the night, Dad said he came back after he took her out to the car. He came back into the house to get, of course she was just in her gown, I don't think she even had a bathrobe, to get an extra blanket. And we thought, well, if he was interested in her having an extra blanket, why, maybe she'd be all right. And someone rapped on a near neighbor down the road here. I was living out on the next road, on Robin Road, and people frequently knocked at our front door to, can we use your water, or do you have a hose here, or something at night, you know. And I didn't pay any attention when my husband got up and went to the door, and I heard this voice say, Bud Peters, who was then a local officer in town, had sent him out to get Dorothy. Her mother had been kidnapped. So when he scraped me off the ceiling, we came down. I woke up my girls that were, I don't remember whether they were in late grammar school or early high school. I said, we're maybe still grammar school. We're going down to Grandma's. She's been kidnapped. Do you want to come with us, or do you want to stay here? Well, of course they did not want to stay there. And when I got down here, they were interviewing my dad. He'd managed to get himself loose, and he had a hard time walking. His balance was bad, and it was particularly worse in the dark. And so he had walked to the nearest neighbors and rapped. They felt so badly because he'd rapped on their door and they didn't hear him. By this time it's midnight or 12:30, I guess. And so then he went on to the next house, who was the gentleman that called the police and had come out and got nuts. Somehow or other it hit the wire services. I guess I don't know whether somebody tapped into the county sheriff's line, or I know it, Oakland Tribune, I think. But it hit everything almost immediately. And I was told later that Highway 80 looked like a Christmas tree with all the cops' cars going up and down. He took her in our car, or their car, and the FBI were here setting up things to intercept any phone calls that came in or anything. And of course they interviewed my father about, now, you and Mrs. Dawson haven't been having any trouble, have you? They were apologized about that afterwards. One of the things that made them wonder what had happened, there was a French door, I'm talking out of film, there was a French door glass that had been broken where the man got into the house, and the outside light, he was afraid they'd notice the broken window when they came home and came in from the garage. So he'd fished a piece of plastic out of the wastebasket that had been over a breakfast roll or something, and had put that up on the inside of the window, and the officers couldn't understand why this window was all patched up. At any rate,
How did you finally catch this?
well, I believe it was starting to get light. Must have been about 5 o'clock in the morning or something like that, 6. The FBI was in the process of showing us how to handle this thing, and the phone rang, and it was for the sheriff's, it was Al Cardoza, that just retired a few years ago, to report that the vehicle had been sighted headed south through Winters. And they tore out of here like they were sucked up in a vacuum cleaner, all these cars out in front. In fact, one guy was still holding onto the door as the cars were taking off. They set up a roadblock out by the milk farm, and the FBI man told me the next morning when we were all having coffee that he'd been with the FBI for 7 years. This first time he'd ever fired a gun and he'd missed. The guy drove through the roadblock, but they were trying to shoot out the tires without hurting my mother, and they didn't. and he got back onto 80, and finally were stopped right down by the nut tree. If I recall right, a new Vacaville City police car, and there was a highway patrol car behind him, and another county car. At any rate, there were 3 cars that boxed him in. He told my mother, who he had in the front seat, "You'd better get in back, this might get rough." He had just fired the sawed-off shotgun over his shoulder through the back window of the car, and it had dropped, when he fired it, had dropped to the floor. Well, she very gladly climbed over the seat, but pulling her blanket behind her, said when she got back there, he said, "Now hand me my gun," which of course she was not about to do. And they forced him off the road, right down by the totaled my folks' car. The side where she had been sitting before she climbed over was wiped out. She was probably back home by 7:30 or 8, and was met by my sister-in-law, who she was supposed to babysit that night, and she said, "Well, what a way to get out of babysitting," and which lightened things up and so forth. But
pretty exciting evening.
Well, it was. It truly. He had her up. She was really frightened. He'd driven north. She remembers passing Bill and Kathy's up on the highway headed towards Calusa, up that way. And he turned off and gone off into the foothills somewhere into what appeared to be an abandoned sheep herder's cabin or something, and down from the outside into a basement area. And she always felt he was waiting for somebody else that didn't ever show up, because they were there for some little time before he headed back this way. So, and they found his car abandoned in Sacramento sometime later. So, who knows? She said, I told him this was a very foolish event. Well, what on earth was he doing this for? Well, he needed some money, and she says, well, we've got a lot of land, but we surely don't have a lot of money, she says. So, anyway, that was that episode.
Pretty exciting. Well, I've talked to a lot of people in Dixon, and of course, the conversation often, revolves around agriculture. I've talked to sheep people and dry farmers, almond farmers, dairy. Oh, but you're the first chicken ranch person.
Well, you see,
is this the only chicken ranch now? The Dawson?
There was a second one out on the west side of town for a time. In fact, a gentleman by the name of James, who had worked with us for a number of years, bought some property out west of town, and I think he's passed away now. It hasn't been a chicken ranch for years. Right now we have the buildings are still there. I kept telling my brother they were getting to be such an eyesore, we should tear them down. And we, about 4 or 5 years ago, we leased the buildings to a gentleman who came to Davis to get a PhD in poultry genetics. He's from Peru, and he has developed his own breed of chickens that are supposed to be very hardy. I know they lay very hard-shelled eggs, and that's one of the problems commercial egg people have, is always keeping the shells firm once they've gone through that initial laying cycle. But I don't know how many birds he has up there now. He's kind of operating, I think, on a shoestring, and I believe markets both eggs and poultry in the Sacramento area, and people come down and pick them up. We're glad to have the buildings used, and I don't know whether he still teaches, whether he teaches a class in Davis or not. His college-age children and helping them, so it is still. But you see, you spoke about the farming and the egg producing. I can't remember what our production was. I worked at the ranch for 5 or 6 years, casing eggs and things. I started out working one harvest. My husband always hired high school kids to help with the grain harvest, and one year we didn't have too much grain in. He said it just wasn't fair to the kids to hire them for a week or two. They could, find jobs that would run all summer. And he thought they could manage if I would drive the bulk truck. So I did for, the week or so that it took to get the grain harvested. And then my husband said, we got so far behind with why don't you come down and case eggs for us so we can kind of get caught up from harvest season. So I did that for about, 7 or 8 years, I guess, about the time the girls were starting. We have 2 daughters, and they were approaching college age, and so I went to work in town for, also agriculturally oriented. I worked for the Soil Conservation Service for 20 years. I think they call it by a different name now, but I can't keep up with the initials. But we had this little small house, and my mother dearly wanted to add another room on or 2. In fact, she went so far as having the plans drawn up to do it. But every time she talked, let's build another room on the house, Dad would buy another 40 acres. And so that's kind of the way it evolved from poultry to farming. And we've been very, very fortunate through the years to have had. We farmed our own dry grain back when everything was dry farmed, and then when the irrigation district got started and land was being leveled up and they were going into row crops and things, from that point on someone else did it. And we've been very fortunate to have really fine people doing that through the years. One man in particular who passed, Mr. Benetti, who passed away a few years ago. His widow still lives down the road down here, but he started out with development leases leveling and putting, and we're blessed. I am so delighted. I am so pleased that freeway is out there, and Dixon keeps going that direction if it's going to go any place, and has not come this direction. We're sitting on, I doubt that there's any better farm soil anywhere in the state, and every time I see 3 more blocks build up and the blacktop on it, it makes me want to cry.
You're not the first person to say that.
Oh,
either.
it's sad. Naturally, towns build up where there's something to bring them there, and I presume here, I think the original, some of Mr. Royer's forebears, and they farmed here. Then the railroad went through, which brought Sylvieville in to Dixon, and so there naturally a town started, I guess, where there was something to attract it. But when we start to grow, and which is inevitable, I guess, in California, the population keeps getting bigger and bigger, that people have to live someplace. But it really just, when I was working for the Soil Conservation Service, they were soil mapping the county. It hadn't been mapped for some 30-odd years. Not that dirt changes, but I guess outside influence changes, and their approach to what kind of soils were here and so forth has changed. But the topsoil here, 18 feet deep, 10 feet deep, just it's too good to cover up with city streets and blacktop. Yeah. So as I say, I feel really blessed that the town has moved the opposite direction from here.
Well, what about the town? Your early memories of the town when you were a little girl. What was Dixon like back then? I mean, some of the businesses and such.
Oh, well, if you had 5 cents to spend or 10 cents to spend. You walked and had the time. You walked uptown after school and maybe had a Coke or a cherry phosphate at Kirby's drugstore. Or,
At Kirby's.
my mother's family came down from Canada in 1930 and bought a little piece of property on the edge of town. The hotel in the little town they'd been in Canada got too much for them to operate, and they, I guess, came down here to be close to her. Well, no, take it back. My mother's sister was 20 years younger than she was.
Hold on just a second. Okay, now let's
And
see.
my
You said your mother's sister.
my mother's sister was
Uh-huh.
20 years younger than she was, and my grandfather did not want her to have to go into Calgary to high school, so he sent her down here to live with my parents so she could go to high school in Dixon. And then a year later they came down and bought the, in fact, it's the property that, part of it that they're having such a hassle about now. It used to be on the edge of town. Right now it's in the middle of town, but it is right behind the grammar school where they've had the housing discussion. I don't know anything about it, but they've been building homes, which some of the neighbors feel they put too many in one spot, and now they want to add some more to it. And La Esperanza or something. There's been a lot of publicity in the paper about it, but that was the acreage that my grandfather and he too. He had a little chicken house and actually had more pigeons than my mother did. So for as long as he was working, why, that's what she and my grandmother had the squab farm.
But that was the edge of town at that
Yeah,
time.
yeah. Yeah, there was no, well, the town, I think, was probably about 1,200 people. I think Sinette could probably tell you more accurately than I can how many kids were in high school at the time we were in school, but I think our graduating classes were like 27 or 32 or something like that. You knew everybody in town. Everybody in town knew you. And
What would your kids do for recreation?
my kids?
No, you
Oh,
as
us.
a kid. You high
Oh.
school kids.
No, we went to football games, we went to basketball games, they had high school dances, we had a theater that had relatively first-run movies, I guess, for the time. I don't,
I guess every year there was the Mayfair.
oh yes, yeah.
What was the Mayfair like in the 20s and 30s?
You know, I can't remember, really. I don't know. You see, I lived in the country. The 20s and 30s, I would have been 9, 10, 11. When I was a little older, I can remember my dad had a Model T that he had cut down into a pickup truck that he used to haul eggs back and forth to town. And I can remember trying to keep that going in the May Day parade, but I think that was probably in the late 30s.
The Model T was in the parade.
Yeah.
I guess it was all decorated.
I presume there were 4 or 5 girls. I can't even remember who was on it. But I know we had a jar of water, or we had a jar, and the parade wound around kind of the same general area that it does now, a little more extensive parade area, I think. And if things slowed down, we hopped off into somebody's front yard and filled up the water jar so we could keep it from boiling, because it just didn't like this slow.
Keep
Yeah.
Put it in the radiator, keep it
Yeah.
cool. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
My truck doesn't like that either.
Yeah.
Slow driving.
Yeah, you just don't. I can't,
Now there was a big, there were horse races. Everybody talks about that. I guess there's still horse races today.
well, Vallejo got our horse races.
Oh, they did.
Yeah, when Vallejo got the county, you see, we had pari-mutuel betting here during Mayfair. In fact, When my 56-year-old daughter was 3 weeks old, my dad had a heart attack at the horse races. Very severe heart attack. And my mother was off at the parimutuel window collecting his bet. And when she got back, he'd been loaded in an ambulance, and we never could figure out why they brought him home. At any rate, they took him to the hospital the next day. But yes, that drew people. The horse races and the parimutuel betting, I think, really added to the number of people that came from out of town, per se. Then when Solana County, I believe I'm right in that information, that when they established the Solana County Fair in Vallejo, the state moved, or whoever moved the parimutuel betting and the racing to Vallejo, and so we didn't have it anymore.
Well, you mentioned the Model T that was made into a truck. It makes me think about the roads. I wanted to ask about the roads.
Dirt.
Dirt.
They were dirt
Uh-huh.
when I was a kid.
I guess they were mud in the winter. Yeah.
Oh boy, yeah. And I don't remember, I can't remember when they were paved. Because actually I have to stop and really think about, I don't know that I remember. It'd be interesting to check with the county and see when these roads were paved.
Just to check your memory.
Yeah, because I don't know. Must have been, I would guess, probably sometime in the late 20s. I don't know.
Well, the other thing is electricity out in these outside of town.
Yeah, well, I think the folks must have gotten electricity fairly soon. And I don't know whether it was available and the people that had owned the 14 acres or 15 acres just hadn't connected up. Because I know Mother, she complained, as I mentioned, the fleas that were on the acreage because it had been a small pig farm. She said it was very inconvenient to try to find a flea that was in your bed with a kerosene lantern at night, but I don't recall when. I don't know when they got the electricity, but I think shortly after they moved out there in the early 20s. We also were fortunate on down the road to have natural gas at a very early time, because when natural gas came to Dixon, it came in Dixon Avenue. And
lucky for you.
So they had the house I grew up in burned down about 2 years ago, but it had a good-sized basement and a great big gas furnace in the basement, because as soon as the gas was available, they put it in.
Now, how about a telephone? Did you have a telephone?
Party line.
Party line.
5 parties.
With Annette Seifer's mother as the
operator. Carrie was the telephone operator. And
so party line must have been kind of fun.
Well, yes. If my mother called her mother in town on a Sunday to see if she had any baking powder, and my grandmother said, "Oh gosh, Faye, no, I don't," then maybe, if you're lucky, 10 minutes later, one of the neighbors calls and said, "I have some baking powder." That happened. I can remember one time, I must have been late grammar school, and I had a cousin my age that lived with my grandmother, and we had both I'd gotten permission to go to the movies that night. Of course, going always involved somebody taking you to town. It wasn't like you could walk out the front door and walk at night. And so I couldn't wait to call my cousin and tell her that I could go to the show, and could she go too. picked up the phone to call her, and the line was busy. And with youthful impatience, I guess I tried relatively frequently to see if the line was getting on towards showtime. And about the 5th time I picked up the phone to try and use it, and it was still busy, I guess I said, "Oh, shut up," and hung up the phone. And my father heard me, and needless to say, I did not go to the movies that night. But, yeah, it's a good life growing up.
Well, what about when you were real young? Now, you said you're born in 21.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was 1920 that Prohibition came in. I think it went out in 33. Do you
Well,
remember
I know
anything about
my
that?
uncle always called his business a Dawson's Cigar Store, I think.
Now, it was a bar, and then I guess in 20 it had to change? Or when did
That
you-
part I can't remember. I can remember, wasn't it the early 30s when Prohibition
Was
went
repealed.
out? And that's when, it was at about that time that Joe Dawson came from Southern California and brought out his brother Ben and Bill, I think. By that time, of course, when the Capitol Hotel burned, Uncle Bill moved across the street to where the opposite corner. What's that? A real estate office. Yeah,
Right.
I think down the corner. It was in that building. And he was still there when my Uncle Joe came up and bought the business. And then, I guess the building across the street where Dawson's is now became available. It had been a hardware store. It was Johnson's hardware store. And for whatever reason, I don't know, they were selling. At any rate, Joe bought the building, and the family owned it until my aunt passed away 3 or 4 years ago. He had retired from the business, I don't know, he'd sold his business 10, 15 years ago. But the name stayed the same. And Harvey, who has the restaurant in there now, had leased space from Joe for several years back. It got started being a restaurant, too, back when the state required that you couldn't have a bar without a restaurant. And there are many stories about Dawson's, and back when we were a big, big sheep area, and I've heard say more sheep and cattle were bought and sold in Dawson's probably than any place else in the area. And my uncle did not like women being in there. Did not like that at all. But World War II changed all that, because nobody could leave town for any entertainment. The Legion Hall would have dances, I don't know how frequently, but people stayed in town for their entertainment, and when the dance had an intermission, they streamed down the street to either Dawson's or the Acme Club for their refreshments during intermission, and then would go back to the Legion Hall. And so with no opportunity really to control it, and I guess women's livers coming along, maybe even in those days, at any rate, and I know I grew up in there on the counter, because I don't suppose my dad ever went to town that he didn't, whichever corner it was, that he didn't stop to see his brothers. And before I started school, of course, Mother was teaching, and I went every place with my dad. But I had friends in school who had never been in there, nor, in fact, one very dear friend of mine who passed away a few years ago said her mother always said to her, "If you have to walk down that side of the street, turn your head the other direction and you go by." So.
Well, how did your family and your uncles survive the Depression in the 30s?
I don't know about my uncles.
Well, how about your family?
My family.
You said the price of eggs went down.
Oh yeah, I don't know whether they were severely in debt at that point in time. You never were hungry because you had plenty to eat.
Especially eggs.
We were visited by. We're about a mile and a half from the train tracks, either direction, and I remember a frequent stream of people coming by looking for. Was there work they could do for food? Well, we didn't have that much work for them to do, but my mother always sent everybody off with a paper bag full of fried egg sandwiches. And I remember her teasing Dad. I don't know whether I mentioned that when this thing was on, that the chickens didn't make any money at 9 cents a dozen, but that she had not lost money on her squabs. And of course, they had, well, I don't know. We survived. I do remember that starting about the 7th or 8th grade, I needed a new winter coat, and it got postponed for 3 years. Now that would have been in the mid-30s, because I graduated from grammar school in 35. 7th grade, I really need a new winter coat. And my mother said, oh, wouldn't you rather have one when you're in the 8th grade? I'll make you a jacket this year, and we'll wait and we'll get the winter coat. Nothing was really ever said about what you heard on the radio and so forth. But then came 8th grade, and gee, I really do need a new winter coat. I really think you'd enjoy it much more if you have it next year when you're a freshman in high school. So I think it was 36 that I finally got my new winter coat, which I wore all through high school, but very, very, very fortunate that it was not something that, I remember there was an extra spending money, but certainly didn't suffer. If they were suffering, they didn't. My folks, I don't know if they ever had an argument or not, but if there were problems, you didn't hear about them. Very, very comfortable growing up. Feel very fortunate. Then, of course, had this younger brother that came along 9 years later, so I wasn't the center of attention after that. But that was great too, because I think it kept my father young far beyond his years. John went off to Berkeley and played a little, not varsity, but what did they call the younger team?
Junior varsity.
Well, whatever.
They call them.
Yeah. And Dad never missed a football game. If they were in Berkeley, he'd go down there and climb those steps. I remember worrying about him, whether he should do that or not. But, and when John was in high school, and they had he and Zanette's brother were in the same class. And they'll tell you a drop of the hat about their championship football team. So Dad he was semi-retired. He had men running the chicken ranch, and so he could go sit and watch all the football practices and everything. So those were good days.
You mentioned their grammar school. We haven't talked about grammar school. Now, you were out in the country, but you went into town for grammar school.
Yeah, Mother was able to get permission for me to go to town to school, since Tremont, which was our nearby country school, was further out in the country than where we lived. We were about a mile from town, and Tremont School was about 2.5 miles from town. So since she was going into school every day, why, they allowed that I could go to school. So I started kindergarten at a very early age, because that was convenient for my teaching mother. And my birthday was in November, and I started in December, I think, to kindergarten when school was out in June, I couldn't go on to the first grade. I wasn't old enough. So, so that first kindergarten, the half year, was in the old grammar school. By the next year, they had purchased a little house right across the street from my grandmother's house to be used as a kindergarten. And Miss Kuntz came to teach. Miss Kuntz, who was later Mrs. Moss, and who hasn't been gone too long. Her husband just passed away last year. I forget. At any rate, and everybody dearly loved Miss Higgins. Miss Higgins had 3rd and 4th grades. Everybody worried about Miss Canupi, who was the 5th grade teacher. You learned a lot, but she was very strict. And it was great. It was nice for me, too, that my grandmother lived right behind the school, so I had some place to hang my hat till time to go home with my mother. But it was small. Everybody knew everybody.
Well, everybody knew everybody, and I've been talking to a lot of people, and I'm always hearing about the groups. I don't know, I guess nowadays you call them the ethnic groups, the Germans, and then there's the Portuguese and the Italians. And
yeah, we have a lot of, well, I think the early settlers here predominantly were German. You know, it's funny, I can't remember as I was growing up thinking anything about what ethnic background people were. I recall, I think we were conscious when I was in high school that there were a lot of Japanese kids in Vacaville, of course, because of the basketball teams and stuff, you know. And we didn't have, I don't think we had any Japanese here. It was many, many years, I think, before we had any African American people here, whether it was because it was an area where there was farming and not some other kind of employment. I don't know. But I don't remember. I know that most of the Portuguese people were involved with dairies, but you didn't think of them as being, I mean, it was something I never really thought about.
other people have told me that too.
Yeah.
It didn't matter.
No.
But the Portuguese, no, they had their own parade, right? The Holy Ghost parade.
When they used to have the Holy Ghost celebration, yeah. I was in school with one fellow in particular whose father and uncles and stuff had been very active in
Now that wasn't Vernon Dutrow, was it?
Well, it was Vernon at the time he was growing up, he lived out past where I lived, and we were good friends. No, who I was thinking of was Al Bello. They started at one point to kind of revive the Holy Ghost celebration. There is a very active group now that Our Lady of Fatima, I think. Al said, well, there'd never be another good Holy Ghost celebration in town because all the good Portuguese were dead, he said. Meaning his father and his uncles and stuff that had worked on it. But, yeah, that was always, except now where my husband grew up in the town of Lincoln, and they had their celebration earlier in the year, I guess, because he was in the high school band in Lincoln and said they always marched in the parade for the Holy Ghost Festival. Well, we never did here, I don't think, because school was out, as far as I can recall.
Yeah, I think it was in June or July.
Yeah. So, I was just looking, my cousin lives down the road from me, my mother's brother's daughter, and she married years ago a fellow. He passed away last year, a fellow by the name of Herb Dutra, and his younger sister had been the little queen. In fact, she came down to a high school reunion last week that we were at, and she had some pictures. Somebody brought her some pictures that they'd taken of her when she'd been the little queen at the festival in town.
There was a little queen and a big queen?
Yeah.
Oh, I never heard about that.
So, a lot of us still kind of aren't too far away, or, of course, I've spent my whole life here outside of a year or two in Placerville and then another year or two in Sacramento. I always seem to get back to Dixon.
Well, now, what about doctors?
Dr. Stolley and Dr. Parsons.
Dr. Stolley and Dr. Parsons.
Trying to remember if there was another one. Those two.
There was a Dr. Hall, but he died.
Oh, Dr. Hall. Yeah, he was on.
He died
I
in
don't.
1935.
Yeah, is that when it was?
I believe
I
so.
know he was on the school board when my. I shouldn't be augmenting it. He was on the school board when, at the time my mother retired in 1930. Although I don't think she'd announced it. Maybe she hadn't announced it. My brother and I were both born in November. And she used to laugh and say Dr. Hall had met her on the street and said, "Faye, I want you to tell me how it is you can manage to have these children and not miss a year of school," because of course nobody taught if they were obviously pregnant in those days. And she informed him she was not a math major for nothing. So, but I cannot remember when Dr. Hall was a practicing doctor. MD. I never just never thought about it. He was always retired as long as I could remember. Dr. Stolley, his daughter-in-law still lives in town. Francis, his son that was a little older than me, has been gone for several years. You find a lot of the people you remember best aren't around anymore, So. But we had good care, I think.
Of course, doctors made house calls.
Oh yes, well they were still making house calls when my daughters are 55 and 56. So 50 years ago, I suppose, which seems like forever to you. Bobby, my youngest daughter, had pneumonia when she was about 4, and the doctor was making a house call when he announced that that's what she had, and he really thought she ought to be in the hospital. They were still making house calls then.
No.
In fact, they're, I think sometimes doctors get a lot of publicity. I know my aunt's doctor here in town, when she spent the last 4 or 5 years of her life confined to her home, and her doctor was always very good to come to the house if they needed her, and that's been within the last 2 or 3 years. So they will still do it. Maybe they don't advertise it or don't do it on a routine basis, but if necessary, they will.
Well, who would you say were I guess you call them the leading citizens of Dawson back in
Dixon?
Back in the old days. I guess the Royers are a pretty important family. I think two of them were mayors, weren't they?
Claude, younger brother Claude, was city attorney. He passed away at a very relatively early age. Well, I think the Moss family, Mace family, Royer family, highly respected people.
The Moss family do. I'm not familiar with Moss.
Mr. Moss worked in the bank. He was in what's now the Bank of America for years. Well, it was the Bank of Dixon,
Bank
I
of
think.
Dixon. Oh, I see.
And in later years, I think he looked after one of the feed warehouses, I think. And he was kind of semi-retired when we used to, where we would get our grain supplies. His daughter-in-law, my kindergarten teacher, also was still.
Now let's see. You
Mr.
said,
Moss's daughter-in-law, Romaine Moss, who was my, not that first half year, but my first full year kindergarten teacher, was still kindergarten teacher. And I think second or third grade teacher when my girls were in school. And of course that happened to a lot of kids around here. The teachers like Miss Higgins or like Mrs. Moss, who stayed on for a number of years, they had a couple of generations of families. And I know Mrs. Moss told me one day that someone had brought her a birthday cake to school, and children, of course, were making a big thing out of it being her birthday and so forth. And she said, "Your youngest daughter stood there. I could see her," she said. "Mrs. Moss, there aren't enough candles on that cake. Didn't you teach my mother?" she said. So, at any rate, it was nice, kind of the continuity of things. So, I run out of things to talk about unless you can think of something else.
I can think
to
of a lot of
ask.
things to talk about. Something I forgot to ask you about before we turned on the tape was Zanette wasn't sure if you had something to do with the American Legion or the Women's Auxiliary.
No. My parents were very active
Oh, that must be
American Legion and auxiliary members.
Of course,
and
your father was a veteran.
right, and that was, I think, a fair back in those Depression days and stuff. I don't know just when the chapter was organized here, but I think that was a social thing as well as just an organization in those days. I think they did. They of course had built that hall there, and
That hall is still in town.
yeah, that's where we had my brother's class had their 50-year reunion there Saturday night, and it's right across from the city park here.
Yeah, I've talked to several people. I've noticed, well, what you said before, social.
Yeah, it was
organization.
it was probably the only place before the fairgrounds were developed. You know, Mayfair used to be an open pavilion, and excuse me, there's my telephone.
Okay, let me stop right here. Now, let's see. We were talking about social organizations before the phone rang.
Yeah, well, as I say, I've never really been much of a. I guess the only thing I was really active in back when my children were quite young, I was president of PTA one year, but as far as clubs and things, I don't know why. Of course, I went up in 1961 61, I went to work in town, and there were lots of other women working, I'm sure, that were active in things, but I guess, and when I retired in 81, I know one of my near neighbors who's gone now was active in Improvement Club and Ladies Aid and one thing another, and she'd call and she said, "Oh, Dorothy, you're not working now. Come along, we'd love to have you come." And I appreciate that, but I just have never been a club type person, regardless of the cause. So
Maybe
I like to
you're
help
growing
out
up
if I
outside of
can.
town.
I don't know. Maybe that's it. I just never. I was a Rainbow Girl back in the days when they had the Rainbow Girls met in Vacaville. They didn't have one here, and both my daughters were.
What's a Rainbow Girl?
Well, Rainbow Girls is affiliated with the Masonic Lodge. There's Job's daughter and Dee Malay, if you have that you must have Masonic affiliation with, I believe. But Rainbow Girls were sponsored by Masonic Lodge, and you didn't necessarily have to have Masonic affiliation to begin. It was for girls 13 and up, I think. Well, times have changed, I guess. They had an active chapter here back when my girls were in school. And they were taught, I think, a certain amount of grace and how to handle themselves in a long dress and so forth. Well, now most of the girls are in jeans and t-shirts or something, you know. The times change, and I think the chapter finally just died out here. And of course the Masonic Lodge combined with the Davis Lodge, I believe, because I understand it was hard to get a lot of their older members to get up the stairs and so forth. And so Weston Jacobs is one that could tell you more about that. He's very active. And
I'm going to be talking to him in a couple of weeks.
So Weston and I were in the same class all through school, and of course his father was our grammar school principal.
Well, let's see.
In recent years, I'm a big plugger for help for kids that want to go to college. That's so expensive, and I was asked many years ago when one of the existing members moved out of the city to help on the board of a scholarship program that was in memoriam to Angus Madden, who was for many years head of what was then First National Bank, now First Northern. And more recently, former teacher, retired. She and her husband have set up a foundation that they asked the Madden board if they would help with, and so I guess that's about my only civic thing that I do. I've been secretary treasurer of those, and I'm glad the Madden Memorial started out, I think, at $100 a year, and this year we don't always do two, but this year we awarded two $1,800 scholarships to local graduates.
$1,800.
And the Morris one, we've been fortunate that the funds are there. That could conceivably vary through the years, but right now it started at $1,300 a year, and it's renewable for 3 more years. And this year we've raised it to $2,000. And once we make our selection, as long as they're eligible, we don't require a grade point once they're in college. They have to be in good standing and be eligible to go again next year, and they can renew the funds on through 4 years. So, and I think that's good. We've been very fortunate with the selections that have been made. The kids have done well. We don't have a lot of follow-up with them once they've gone on, but we always hope they'll come back to Dixon and be a good member of the community. Sometimes they come back, sometimes they press on, but I felt good about being able to help with that.
Yeah, that's a great thing to do. so expensive.
Oh, it's unbelievable. Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, $2,000 is what might pay for Cal State tuition 1 year.
Well, I know the recipient last year wrote 2 years ago, I guess, she wrote a sweet little note that it was certainly nice to get this, be able to get this, because it certainly did help with buying her books. You know.
They sure are expensive. Now, is this just for Dixon?
They have to be Dixon High graduates.
Oh, that's terrific.
Yeah, and they, the Morris has even a further restriction that they must have attended 3 out of the last 4 years, because I think they thought it might be attractive enough on down the road that somebody might just move to Dixon to be eligible.
Do a semester.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's good.
Because I think eventually on down the road it'll probably be a full load. But at any rate, it's I'm sure the kids appreciate it, because, and I notice when we require verification for their next year's eligibility, if they send us a copy of their reg card and their classes they're signed up for, that would probably suffice. Some of them go through the registrar's office, and it's very official, and that generally shows that most of them have become eligible for other things, like there's the local Sparling scholarship, which is, I believe, supposed to be also just for Dixon graduates. And then there's, I don't understand them all, there's Pell
Grant.
Pell Grant and Cal Grants and
That's
stuff
another
like,
thing.
yeah. And most of these kids, I've noticed, that have happened to use that means of verifying their next year, have all gotten other assistance too. So it's out there if they go after it, I guess. But
a little extra money sure can hurt.
Oh, it makes
So many students are working almost full time and going to school full time.
Yeah.
That little extra money, at least they can work part time.
Well, that was the thought of the Madden board through the years. Olin Tim was very active on that board, as had been his mother before him. And now we have Peter, Dr. Tim, on the board. So we've had 3 generations on that board. But I got so involved with relationships, I've forgotten what I was going to say.
Well, we were talking about the scholarship.
Yeah. Oh, I know what I was going to say. It was Olin's feeling through the years that too many students, if they couldn't get the assistance or had to work too hard, it was detrimental to their education, really. And he preferred to help students that weren't going to have to struggle too much, where a little bit of help would go a long ways, as opposed to somebody getting a little bit of help and just not being able to make it, you know.
That's great.
So.
Well, that's a real nice little contribution to Dixon.
I'm glad I thought of that, because sometimes I feel kind of useless, but it's kind of fun to just be retired.
Well, it's good if you're going to do something effective.
Yeah.
And that sounds something real effective. Well, another contribution is sitting here and talking to me in front of this video camera.
I don't know
A
how.
little contribution to the library.
I hope it's a contribution. I really do.
Yeah,
We're
well, you and
fortunate to have a good
several
library.
others are contributing, and it's going to be a nice little collection.
It'd be interesting to see it.
Yeah. Okay, well,
I probably
I'll turn
wish
this
I
on.
hadn't talked so much.
Oh, you talked about the average amount. Well, thanks again.
You're welcome.